Hey guys, it's Phil here from TechSmart, and today we're going to be comparing the Nexus 5 to the Nexus 4. So starting off, let's take a look at the size of these two devices. The Nexus 5 is 5.43 inches tall by 2.72 inches wide and just 0.34 inches thick. The Nexus 4, on the other hand, is 5.27 inches tall by 2.7 inches wide and a little bit thicker at 0.34 inches thick. Now, holding the phones in the hands, they definitely have a different feel to them. The Nexus 4 has that glass backing, while the Nexus 5 has a bit sharper, more boxed off feel. The Nexus 4 is going to be a little bit heavier. It's 4.9 ounces, whereas the Nexus 5 is only 4.59 ounces. So taking a look at the screens on these two devices, the Nexus 5 is just gorgeous. It has a 5-inch IPS display. The resolution is 1920 by 1080, and because of that, it gives it a awesome pixel density of 445 ppi. The Nexus 4 has a 4.7-inch IPS display. The resolution is 768 by 1280. Because of that, the pixel density is a little bit smaller. It's 318 pixels per inch. However, because it is a slightly smaller screen and 318 ppi is still very high, the screen still does look very sharp and crisp. However, the Nexus 5 is going to take it away in this category. As far as software goes, the Nexus 5 is running KitKat. That's no secret whatsoever. There's new icons, theming, and just much better integration with Google. The Nexus 4, however, is running Android 4.3 Jelly Bean, although it will be getting the KitKat update very soon, so there's not much reason in comparing the two. However, with KitKat, you are getting that ability to have SMS through the Hangouts app, full screen immersive mode, as well as you can check out our video on all of our top 11 hidden features of Android 4.4 KitKat. Now, of course, we're going to have to benchmark these two devices because hardware is a huge deal. The Nexus 5 is rocking the Qualcomm Snapdragon 800 processor. That is the fastest Android processor out to date. It has a quad-core 2.3 gigahertz chipset, as well as 2 gigabytes of RAM, the Adreno 330 graphics. The Nexus 4 is no slouch whatsoever. It has the Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Pro processor. That's the quad-core 1.5 gigahertz chipset, and there's also as well 2 gigabytes of RAM. Now, you're going to have the Adreno 320 graphics, which are last year's generation as opposed to the 330 and the Nexus 5. So it's going to be interesting to see how these two phones stack up against each other in the benchmarks. We are running Geekbench 3, which isn't the most accurate. However, it does give you a pretty good representation amongst most Android devices. As you can see from the results, the Nexus 5 scored a 935 on the single core score, while the Nexus 4 scored a 495 on the single core score. Looking at the multi-core score, you scored a 2787 on the Nexus 5, and the Nexus 4 scored a 1421, so a pretty big jump on the Nexus 5's end. Now we're going to run the GFX benchmark, and just as a reminder, the Nexus 5 has the Adreno 330 graphics, where the Nexus 4 has the Adreno 320. And as you can see from the results, the Nexus 5 definitely dominated again. In the T-Rex benchmark, it scored 24 frames per second, while the Nexus 4's T-Rex benchmark scored 19 frames a second. On the Egypt benchmark, you scored 52 frames per second on the Nexus 5 and just 35 frames per second on the Nexus 4. So it's clear that the Adreno 330 graphics is definitely an improvement over the 320. So next, let's take a look at the camera on these two devices, because the Nexus 4 was constantly bashed down because of the camera quality. Well, good thing is they definitely improved it greatly in the Nexus 5. They're both still the 8 megapixel cameras. However, with the Nexus 5, you add a wider aperture of f2.5 as well as optical image stabilization. Now, the Nexus 4 itself is still just an 8 megapixel camera. There's nothing too fancy going on there. However, we all know that the Nexus 4 tend to be a little bit soft on photos and desaturating a lot of the colors. The Nexus 5 definitely improved that. However, the shutter lag is to be determined. As far as the device bands go, this is something crazy important to talk about because the Nexus 4 does not support LTE, and that was definitely one of its biggest problems when it was released last year. However, they've since updated that. The Nexus 5 does support LTE, which is great, although both devices are going to support HSPA Plus and all the networks that are lower than that LTE standard. So as far as battery life goes on these two devices, the Nexus 5 has a 2300 milliamp hour battery. It's going to give you roughly 12 hours of use. The Nexus 4 has a 2100 milliamp hour battery, and in actual use, it is pretty solid. It's going to get you a full day of somewhat minimal use. However, once you're streaming videos and playing games, that's really going to diminish the battery life on just about any phone out there. Now, finally, pricing and configuration of these two devices. Since they are both sold off contract, with the exception of the Nexus 5 being sold through Sprint, the Nexus Nexus 5 is going to run you $350 for the 16GB model and $400 for the 32GB model. Now, the Nexus 4 will be $300 for the 8GB and $350 for the 16GB. So when looking at these prices, if you have neither of these devices and you're looking to get one, I would definitely say spend the $50 more and get yourself a Nexus 5. It's not that it's a substantial upgrade, although it is an upgrade. It's going to be running LTE, you're going to have a better camera, a larger display with a much higher pixel density. It's just going to be a really solid choice, and especially for $350 off contract, you really can't beat it. With that said, if you have a Nexus 4 right now, don't sweat it. You don't necessarily need to upgrade. As we showed right now in the comparison, they're different. However, if those differences aren't really affecting you, then you're going to be fine for the next year or so with your Nexus 4, unless if you do need the latest and greatest technology. However, that LTE upgrade is a big one depending on the area that you live in. Anyways guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to like this video if you liked it, subscribe for tons more Nexus 5 content, and we'll see you in the next video. Later.